Welcome to AP Environmental Science Ecosystems. Because this should all be a review, or at least most of it should be a review, we're going to go through quite a few topics today. So we're going to start off with Introduction of Ecosystems, and these are going to be in no particular order, but Introduction of Ecosystems. The learning objective here explain how the availability of resources influence species interactions, and this enduring understanding is key. Ecosystems are the result of both biotic and abiotic interactions. Skipping forward in the topics to topic 1.8, primary productivity, we're going to talk about how solar energy is acquired and transferred by living organisms. We're going to talk about trophic levels, how energy flows and matter cycles through trophic levels. Sticking with energy flow, we're going to talk about the 10% rule. So determine how the energy decreases as it flows through an ecosystem. And all of this happens in food chains and food webs. So we're going to describe food chains and again, talk about trophic levels and food chains. Like I said, most of this should be review for you from CP Bio, Honors Bio, or AP Bio, but you can pause this now and write down the vocab. So starting with the broad overview, ecology. Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with one another and with the abiotic components of the environment. So it again incorporates that biotic part as well as the abiotic components of the environment. Often focuses on energy transfer, as well as transfer of matter. In fact, this root word from ecology or ecosystems is the same root word that you see in economics. So a lot of people talk about ecology as the accounting of nature or the economy of nature. Okay, and again, this should all be a review from bio. And I like this quote from John Muir because it illustrates the complexity of ecosystems. When you try to change any single thing, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So we've already talked about what the environment is in this class, but the environment is the external conditions in which an organism lives its life and which it interacts, and it's composed of both biotic and abiotic components. The biotic factors here, it just has all the kingdoms of life, and then the abiotic factors, it just has a few of them, but it could be anything from soil pH to the nutrient levels and water. It could be temperature or humidity, any of those abiotic or non-living factors. For the hierarchical levels of organization in ecology, I will let you pause this and copy down the vocab, but I'm actually going to illustrate it using the next slide. So you see that diagram on the left is the same, but I'm going to use the diagram on the right. With ecology, we're starting with the individual. We could also talk about the species right there, but we're talking about the individual, one individual. If you were to look at anything lower, you might be looking at something with anatomy and physiology, or you might be looking at cellular biology or even macromolecules, but the individual is where we start with in ecology most of the time. So one individual. A population is all of the individuals of a single species in a given area. The community, so in this case we have elk, the community is all of the populations of all of the different species in a given area. So we don't just have the elk, but we also have the moose, the spruce trees or fir trees, whatever they are. What is that, a mountain lion, owls, beavers, and hare. The ecosystem is both the biotic and abiotic components of that area. So we have the community plus the air, the water, the temperature, the precipitation, the salinity levels of the water, the pH of the soil, all of those abiotic components. Biomes are kind of odd and they're not listed here, but we would put a biome right there. And we talked about biomes before in this class and we'll continue to do so, but a biome is a group of similar ecosystems that all share similar abiotic components. They share similar temperature, they share similar precipitation levels, they're in maybe a similar area. So in this case, we have the boreal forest, which is shaded in this blue color up here. And the boreal forest is not just continuous boreal forest the entire time. There might be some meadows, there might be some riparian areas, there might be some clearings, there might be some rockfall areas where You have primary succession starting, and it's just lichen and mosses on the rocks. You have all of that stuff that's in this overall biome of the boreal forest, but you have several ecosystems. You have the parkland, you have the forest itself, you have the meadows, you have the riparian areas, all of that stuff. And then the biosphere is all life on Earth. So just continuing on with some vocab, habitat and niche. A species' habitat or an individual's habitat or a population's habitat is the place in which that organism lives out its life. Its niche, though, is the role that it plays in its habitat. Basically, its job. If you think about everything that it does, the sum total of everything that it does and everything that other organisms do to it, that is its niche. So it could include what eats it, any disturbances that it makes. So maybe it clears out area as it walks or tramples soil. Maybe it's a burrowing animal and it aerates the soil. What supporting functions it plays, like pollination that we have up here, all of those different things. Okay, there is many examples that we could give, but this is just an overview. Okay, sometimes organisms will separate their different niches so that they don't compete with one another. Okay, if they do share the same niche, then competition is going to ensue. Okay, so bees and butterflies do compete for flowers. They do compete for that nectar. They compete for that pollen. Okay, bees tend to go after the pollen more than butterflies because they use it as a protein source, but that doesn't matter. But they will minimize competition based on flower morphology. Okay, bees tend to like blues, purples, whites, some reds, yellows. In their flower colors, they tend to have a certain shape that are specific for bee pollinated flowers, whereas butterflies see red really well, and bees don't see red quite as well as butterflies. And butterfly flowers tend to have different morphology. They tend to have a flat landing pad for that butterfly to land on, and they tend to have the nectar way down inside of the flower in these really thin tubes that the butterfly proboscis can get down into that a bee's proboscis would not be able to because it's shorter. Okay, so the plants that they've co-evolved with have minimized some competition, but competition still occurs. All right, but just getting back to habitat and niche, just to differentiate the two with a simple example, we can look at elk. Elk, their habitat is the forest edges, the parkland, the tundra of the boreal forest in Western North America. The niche, though, they're a roaming terrestrial herbivore, so they move from place to place. They're on land, and they're eating plants. They eat the vegetation from ground to the lower branches of trees. They can only reach so high. All right. Some species they may overgraze, some grasses, some trees they may overgraze. Others they keep in check from taking over an ecosystem. Okay, they will disturb the soil with their hooves. So as they walk and as they run through this area, they disturb the soil and they create little pockets of ground that seeds can germinate in. They'll fertilize the soil with their feces. They'll also spread some seed with their feces, but not as much as other herbivores would. And then they're prey for wolves, mountain lions, occasionally brown bears. They're food for scavengers, and they're hosts for parasites. Okay, they do all of those things and honestly many more. That's their niche. Okay, a brief detour into physics or chemistry. You might have seen this in chemistry, the 3 laws of thermodynamics. The first and second laws are the ones that we'll talk about in this class, but the third law I'm not even going to discuss because we won't talk about it in this class. Okay, the first law is basically the law of conservation of energy, basically stating that the total energy in an isolated system is constant. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but it can be transferred from one form to another, or it can be converted from one form to another. All right. The second law of thermodynamics states that as you move through natural processes, the transfer or the conversion of energy goes from higher level states, so something up here, to lower level states of energy. And it typically is irreversible, or it is irreversible. You can only go down the staircase. You can't go up the staircase. Okay, so it's constantly moving towards a lower state of energy. Heat is the lowest state of energy. So on my diagram, heat would be down at the bottom. And eventually, all of the energy in the entire universe is going to go down into this low energy state of just thermal heat energy. Okay, this is called the law of entropy. And there's a lot more to it than just that, but that's the basics that we need to know for this class. All right, so that first slide talked about how ecology is often focuses on energy transfer. That is typically through feeding relationships. Okay, so all feeding relationships all boil down to producer-consumer relationships. However, in many textbooks, they break them up into 3 types of feeding relationships. Okay, there's producer-consumer, which is the big one, and beneath that, or a subcategory of that, is predator-prey. Okay, so that's a type of producer-consumer relationship. We also have symbiotic relationships, and one of these is definitely a producer-consumer or relationship. It has to do with trophic levels and all that stuff, and that's parasitism. The other 2 may or may not have to do with feeding at all. Okay. Realistically, feeding relationships, producer-consumer, the one that you should know. Predator-prey, you will see a lot. And you'll see a lot of symbiotic relationships. They are also key, but know that they don't necessarily have to do with feeding. Parasitism always does, but commensalism and mutualism does not necessarily have to do with feeding or energy transfer. So for this slide, you can pause this now and just jot all this down, just copy all of this. Come up with your own examples for detritivores, omnivores, carnivores, and herbivores, and I'll talk about each one of them on the next slides. So the 2 types of autotrophs are photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. Photo, you see that root word for light. These are organisms that perform photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from the ground, or the surrounding environment in general. Typically it's plants, and we're talking about bringing it up from their roots, so from the soil. Light, this is typically sunlight, but it can be other forms of light, such as artificial light in a grow house. And they take carbon dioxide, water, and light and create organic molecules. Primarily sugar, you see the chemical formula for glucose here, as well as oxygen, which is a byproduct which they release into the atmosphere. Okay, you guys definitely need to know this formula. You need to know 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus sunlight, the energy from sunlight. Note that it's above the arrow because it is more like a catalyst for this reaction. Gives you 1 molecule of sugar and 6 molecules of oxygen. Okay, what you do not need to know for this class is the many steps of photosynthesis. So you don't need to know, the light-dependent reactions, the light-independent reactions, the Calvin cycle, any of that stuff. You do not need to know any of that for this class, just this formula. Okay, the organisms that perform this, plants, algae, some classes of algae, so diatoms, phytoplankton, green algae, euglena, which you don't need to know, and then some bacteria will do photosynthesis as well. Primarily cyanobacteria, they were the original photosynthesizers. Chemoautotrophs we won't really discuss in this class much, if at all. Photoautotrophs are the ones that you do need to know primarily. But chemoautotrophs are bacteria and archaea, and they include several different types. We will talk about nitrogen fixers, but you don't really need to know that they're chemoautotrophs for that discussion. All right. But just so that you get a sense of where you can find those chemoautotrophic bacteria, you typically find them in places that are without light or without competition from plants in one way or another. So inside this pipe, you have iron oxidizing bacteria that are literally taking that iron from the inside that pipe, oxidizing it, and getting energy from that chemical reaction. You have sulfur oxidizers and reducers down in a deep sea hydrothermal vent, and you have a whole host of different chemoautotrophs in grand prismatic hot springs in Yellowstone. This is too hot for plants to survive. So you see different renes that correspond to different species of these chemoautotrophic bacteria. When we talk about producers, for the producer-consumer feeding relationship, so now we're shifting gears more into the feeding relationships themselves, we're talking about autotrophs. So whenever you see producer, know that it means autotroph. The two are synonyms in this class. Okay, all of them are going to be at the base of the food chain, and every food chain is going to have a producer at the base. That could be a chemoautotrophic bacteria in a deep sea hydrothermal vent where there are no plants, but in most cases it's going to be a plant or an algae, a diatom, any type of plankton. When we talk about producers, they do something called primary production. Okay. Again, they're at the base of the food chain and they're getting their energy from sunlight. And primary production is basically the energy or the biomass that they are creating from photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, but we're just going to stick for photosynthesis from here on out. For this equation, this is one of the simplest equations that we'll talk about in this class. We have gross and net primary productivity. Gross primary productivity is the total amount of chemical energy, could also be biomass that producers create in a given amount of time. How much photosynthesis occurred over a year in a given area? Okay. Now, producers also have to respire. Okay, so they have to take those sugars that they make, and they have to do cellular respiration with those. So we're going to subtract respiration from gross primary production to give us net primary productivity. Okay. Again, plants have to use the sugars that they create to fuel their own bodies, to fuel their growth, to fuel their reproduction, to fuel their version of the immune system, to fight off bacteria or fungal infection, to create, any type of tissue that they're creating, any type of molecules that they're creating. They have to use cellular respiration. Plants have mitochondria as well. So that's one of the big misconceptions that people have about plants is they think that they don't do respiration. They think that they don't have mitochondria. They absolutely do. So for this formula, we are typically interested in net primary productivity. It's what we can more easily measure in some cases. But net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus the respiration that producers do. Okay, not the respiration that consumers do, but the respiration that the producers are doing. All right. So the units for this are going to be a little wonky looking. We're talking about kilocalories per meter squared per year. Okay. It's because if you were to go out in the field and do this, you would, find some area of forest. This is your forest, and you would basically do make a square in that forest, and you measure all of the primary production in that square of forest in a given year. So you would have your meter squared, and you would do this over an entire calendar year, and you would be measuring either kilocalories or grams of biomass or kilograms of biomass. You could also do kilometers squared, doesn't matter. You could do this over, 10 years, but why would you? But you might do 1 week. Just showing that the units can change. The units are your biomass or energy over a given area over a given amount of time. But typically you'll see kilocalories per meter squared per year or kilograms per meter squared per year. So let's see what this really looks like. Let's say that you're a researcher and you go out and you measure the net annual primary productivity of a temperate deciduous forest. Say that you're in Kentucky and you measure the primary productivity of an area of deciduous forest. You find that it is 12,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year. That is your NPP. If respiration by the producers is 15,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year, so that's R, what is the gross annual primary productivity of this ecosystem in kilocalories per meter squared per year? Pretty easy. All that you have to do if my animations come up. Net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus respiration. We are given net primary productivity, and we have to solve for gross primary productivity, and we're given respiration. Rearrange the formula, add 15,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year to both sides to get gross primary productivity of 27,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year. All right, pretty simple. So again, this is the total amount of energy or total amount of biomass that these producers are producing per year. Since you guys are doing your biome projects right now, you should get an idea of net primary productivity based off the different biomes. What are the most productive? Swamps and marshes in your terrestrial ecosystems, swamps and marshes, tropical rainforests are the most productive, followed by temperate forests, and then, going down from there. Unsurprisingly, your polar deserts and your regular deserts are have the lowest primary productivity. Aquatic systems, estuaries are the most productive, and then lakes and streams, the continental shelf, and then the open ocean is the least productive. We can see that same thing basically in the form of a map. So wherever you have areas that have high temperature, high precipitation, tend to be your most productive. Those are going to be your tropical rainforests. Okay. If you are lacking in one of those two, so say that you are lacking in temperature, you have a very cold area, the boreal forest, the northern tundra are going to be very much less productive. If you're lacking in precipitation, your deserts are not going to be very productive at all. Okay, even if they might be hot. So temperature and precipitation are really what determine this. And it's really, what determines a biome as well. In the water, what we're typically looking for is proximity to light and proximity to continents, because the continents are going to be your source of nutrients. So nutrients are going to flow down rivers and exit via estuaries into the ocean, which is why estuaries are the most productive. Note this area right here at the northern Russia, where major rivers feed. So where there's going to be a lot of nutrients and where there's going to be a lot of sunlight are going to be the most productive. Okay. One thing that is kind of weird here is that you notice that the polar areas actually tend to be more productive in the open ocean than the mid-latitude areas in the open ocean. And we'll talk about this why in class. Sticking with the ocean, we can view this in another way, and that's with depth. So it should come as no surprise that in the photic zone, you're going to have more primary productivity, especially with photosynthesis. That's where light is going to penetrate. Okay. As you get down, don't even worry about the second bullet point. As you get down into the water column where no light is going to penetrate that water column, you're not going to have much primary productivity at all, except for maybe some chemosynthesis down here at like a deep sea hydrothermal vent. That might, or that will allow some primary productivity in the little ecosystem that's self-contained there. Okay. Most of what is going to feed everything in the everything in the aphotic zone is going to be what we call marine snow, which is going to drift down into the water column or down the water column. And that's basically dead stuff that's floating down in the water column, and stuff down here is going to be eating it. Okay, so that's really where most of the energy for all of those weird deep sea creatures that you've seen in nature shows, they're mostly getting their nutrients and energy from marine snow, which again is dead organic matter settling down in that water column. Okay, again, producers, they're going to be at the base of every food chain. No matter what food chain you're looking at, you're always going to see a producer at the base of the food chain. Okay, so you're going to see plants down at the bottom of the food chain, or algae, or photosynthetic bacteria, or whatever. Now, a food web may not be, it may not have them literally at the base of it, like this tree is kind of on the upper left, but all of the arrows are coming away from this tree. Okay, so it's still at the base of that food chain. Okay. without that constant supply of sunlight going down and quote unquote feeding these plants, you're not going to have the primary productivity. Now, there can be catastrophic events such as impact winters or nuclear winters that can block all of the sunlight, and you remove the trees, you remove the grasses, they die because they don't have any sunlight. Everything else is going to start to follow in that ecosystem. Okay. Now that was a whole awful lot about producers. Let's switch to consumers. There are 5 types of consumers. We're going to talk about each one of them individually. All consumers have to eat other things or consume other things to get their energy and their nutrients. Okay, so that's why they're called consumers rather than producers. The first type that we'll talk about are herbivores. They eat plants. All that they eat are plants as well as other producers, such as this little fish eating algae off of this rock. They're just going to eat plants. Okay, they may not look like herbivores in your eyes, like this fruit bat may not look like an herbivore, but all that it eats is fruit or flowers, and it's definitely an herbivore. For carnivores, those are organisms that only eat meat or only eat other animals. We have 2 different types. We have predators, which actively hunt and kill animals for food, and then we have scavengers, which eat previously dead animals. Okay, many predators will act as scavengers if the opportunity arises, but very few dedicated scavengers will act as predators. So you very rarely see that other arrow going up. Very few scavengers will act as predators. You'll never see a vulture acting as a predator, but you'll often see wolves acting as scavengers. And again, even if the animal doesn't look like a classic carnivore, like this puffin, you may look at a puffin and think, oh, that's really cute. It's not like this African wild dog or this snow leopard or this rattlesnake, but because its entire diet is fish, it is definitely a carnivore. Omnivores, these are organisms that eat both plants and animals. The way that AP likes to say this is that they eat at several trophic levels. Okay, so they eat at the trophic level, at the second trophic level where an herbivore traditionally would. They could eat at the quaternary trophic level where a top predator often would. Okay, this is the group where we belong, is eating both plants and animals, being an omnivore. And that root word omni basically means every, so we eat everything. So if we look at one of those sub-feeding relationships within the producer-consumer relationship, we have the predator-prey relationship. So within the producer-consumer relationship, we also have the predator-prey. Predators eat prey. Pretty simple. And you guys probably know this from elementary school. Predators can be carnivores. They can also be omnivores in many cases. A grizzly bear is going to, a grizzly bear that's eating salmon is acting as a carnivore. But if it's eating, berries, then it's, acting like an herbivore. It is an omnivore. Okay. The prey can be an herbivore. So like this water buffalo is an herbivore, but this mouse is an omnivore. Okay, it'll eat insects, it'll eat seeds, it'll eat both plants and animals. Okay, also other carnivores. Many carnivores eat other carnivores. Okay, but predator prey, you guys know this from elementary school. One that you probably don't know from elementary school is the detritivore. Detritivore are animals that eat dead organic matter, and that includes waste. So this dung beetle is eating, maybe elephant dung, rhinoceros dung. It's eating waste. Carrion flies and their maggots, vultures, all of these octopi and maybe hagfish and everything else that's eating this whale carcass, earthworms, they are all eating dead organic matter. Okay, and detritivore, you'll probably see the term detritus in this class. I hope I spelled it right. That U is looking awful weird to me. Detritus, whether you spell it like that or like that, I don't remember which, and maybe both of those are wrong. Detritus is dead organic matter. Okay, so that's where that term comes from. Similar to a detritivore is a decomposer. Decomposers include fungi, bacteria, and some protists that break down dead organic matter or waste. They also break down detritus. However, The difference between them is key. The difference between them is pretty crucial. These guys don't have mouths. They do not ingest things internally. What a fungus or what many bacteria will do is release digestive enzymes outside of their cells, break down whatever medium they're on, whether it's wood or trees or animal remains or whatever it is. They'll release those enzymes outside their cells, break down that organic matter, and then re-ingest those nutrients back into their cells. Whereas a detritivore is an animal, it has a mouth, and it will eat and digest things internally. So decomposers digest things externally, fungi, bacteria, some protists. Detritivores digest things internally, animals. So that was all the producer-consumer relationship. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about symbiotic relationships. Now, symbiotic relationships, whenever anybody hears symbiotic, they immediately think mutualism. But all three of these are symbiotic relationships, okay? So symbiotic is the umbrella term for mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. All that it means is that it is, together or with, and then life. Okay, so they're living together, whether that's a parasitic relationship or a mutualistic relationship. Again, this should be a review from biology class. All right. So mutualism, both parties are going to benefit. I really like the human and the dog. We provide the dog with food and a home. The dog provides us with protection, hunting, companionship, herding of sheep, whatever it is, they're providing us with a service. Okay, a cleaning shrimp and a more, it looks like some kind of eel. I don't think it's a moray eel, but a cleaning shrimp and an eel. This cleaning shrimp is picking the little scraps of food between the eel's teeth. The eel is getting dental work. The shrimp is getting a free meal in the form of food scraps. The bee and the flower, bees transfer pollen from one flower to another. As a reward, they get nectar from those flowers, as well as pollen, which they eat. And while they're transferring pollen from one flower to another, they're pollinating them, they're allowing the plants to do sexual reproduction. They're taking the male gamete and the pollen to the female gamete on another flower. Corals we'll talk about are a symbiotic or mutualistic, see even I fall into that trap, a mutualistic relationship between a animal and an algae. And then lichen, which we will also talk about later on in this course, are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. And a lot of some new research is coming out that there might be a third partner in here, a yeast, which is also a type of fungus. All right, but they're all living together. The fungus and the lichen provides the algae with protection, with basically a home, with waterproofing, as well as breaking down nutrients from the rock and giving that algae minerals from the rock. And the algae is performing photosynthesis and giving the fungus sugars. So everybody benefits in mutualism. It's the happy relationship. If you were to draw a face for this one, it'd be a smiley face. That's a really bad smiley face, kind of creepy. I'm going to erase it. For commensalism, you won't find as many examples as the other two, but commensalism, one party benefits, the other one is neutral. Okay, so it's neutral to the second party. My favorite example is the egret, the cattle egret, and whatever large mammal they're following. So in this case, it's a water buffalo. The water buffalo walks around and it eats grass, and as it does so, it disturbs any grasshoppers that are in the soil or in between the blades of grass and the vegetation. The grasshoppers jump away, and the cattle egret jumps off of the water buffalo's back, grabs the grasshopper, comes back up onto the water buffalo's back. Water buffalo is not helped nor harmed in this relationship, but the egret gets easy meal. They are following this water buffalo as they move through and disturb the insects, and as those insects move to avoid the water buffalo, they're easy prey for the bird. Okay, the water buffalo might be slightly annoyed that the bird's always on its back, but it doesn't really care. Okay, I mean it's not being harmed, is what I'm saying. The example in the middle, we have a large fish, in this case a shark, and all of the remoras that are traveling alongside it. The remoras are basically traveling in the wake of this shark, and the shark is basically propelling them forward. They're moving along in the water that's flowing alongside that shark, and they're essentially getting a free ride without hurting the shark, without helping the shark, but they're conserving energy. And then we have orchids on a tree. So these orchids are separate from this tree. They're not part of this tree, but they are living on the tree. They're basically using the tree as access to sunlight, the tree is neither harmed nor hurt in this relation, or neither harmed nor benefited, but the orchids get a place to live. And then we have parasitism. Like I said, this is the one where it is truly a feeding relationship, where you have energy transfer and nutrient transfer from one individual to another. So the different ones that are on this slide, we have mistletoe right here, which is a parasitic plant on what I think is an apple tree, maybe, I don't know. They're often on apple trees. But this mistletoe, its roots literally go into the wood of the host tree. And as the host tree does photosynthesis and draws up water and nutrients from the soil and all of that stuff, the parasitic mistletoe will literally tap into those nutrient reserves and draw those nutrients out. It also does photosynthesis. There are many parasitic plants that don't do photosynthesis at all, but this one does do some photosynthesis, but it's still parasitizing the host. Its roots are stealing the host's energy and nutrients. We have chytrid fungus on a frog up at the top, which we'll talk about later on. We have parasitic wasp caterpillars that have erupted, parasitic wasp larvae that have erupted from this caterpillar, and they are in the cocoon stage right here. We have white nose syndrome on the nose of this on the nose of this bat. It is a fungus that parasitizes bats. We have a tick, which will parasitize you, and a mosquito, which will also parasitize you. Okay, so one way to represent feeding relationships is with a food chain. A food chain is a graphical representation of feeding relationships showing how energy and nutrients move through different trophic levels. Okay, so as they move up from one level to the next inside of this chain. Okay, and each organism is a link in the chain. One mistake that I always see students do is the direction of the arrows. So make sure that the arrows are going from who is being eaten to who is eating it. So the plant, this sunflower, is being eaten by this grasshopper, which is being eaten by the mouse, which is being eaten by the snake, which is being eaten by the eagle. Okay, they do not go the opposite direction. Okay, so think about into whose mouth those things are going. The plant is going into the grasshopper's mouth, so we have the arrow going from the plant to the grasshopper. Okay, these are the terms that you'll typically see for this. Note that not every chain goes up to quaternary consumers. There may only be tertiary consumers, and that might be where it tops out. Alternatively, it could go even further, especially in a marine food chain, but we're just going to stick with quaternary consumers as like the topmost one for the most part in this class. Now, up to this point, I basically incorporated both energy and nutrients together as if they were the same thing and if both are moving in the same way in an ecosystem, but they are not. Energy is a one-way street, but nutrients are recycled. Let me explain. So with energy, I'll use, let me see what they use. So they use red for nutrients, so I will use purple for energy. Energy starts with the sun. Okay, so purple is energy. Energy starts with the sun, goes down to the plants. The plants are the producers, the grass in this case. They are being eaten by the primary consumer. The grasshopper is getting its energy from eating the grass. Okay, it's calories. Okay, calories or kilocalories being a unit of energy. Okay, those grasshoppers are being eaten by the snakes. Yes, snakes, some snakes will eat grasshoppers, like garter snakes. They are getting their energy from the grasshopper. They are breaking down the sugars in the grasshopper, the carbohydrates, the lipids to get energy. Okay, and then the eagle is eating the snake. Everything is going to die and everything is going to be decomposed. And those decomposers, in this case the bacteria, are getting energy from all of those things, from the grass, the grasshoppers, the snake, the eagle, from all of their waste, from all of their dead bodies. All right, that is where energy stops. Energy is going to stop with your decomposers. So energy basically goes through an ecosystem from the sun to the decomposers, and then it stops. Okay, it's just stonewalled there. It just stops there. Okay. So energy is a one-way street. It only flows in one direction and it cannot be recycled. The grass will never get its energy from the decomposers. All right, the grass will get its energy from the sunlight. It does not eat bacteria. Okay, it gets its energy from sunlight. Nutrients, on the other hand, do not start with the sun, first off. They're in the soil. So we're going to see most nutrients are going to be in the soil. Obviously, there are exceptions. Those nutrients are going to be taken up by the grass. When I say nutrients, what I could mean are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK, which you might see on fertilizer packets. Okay, it could be iron. It could be, I don't know, zinc. You know, I forget what if living things need zinc, but maybe zinc. It could be any nutrients, molybdenum or whatever, sulfur. I don't know. All right, I'm drawing a blank. So the grass is going to pick up all these nutrients, and the grass is going to be eaten by the grasshopper, which is going to be eaten by the snake, which is going to be eaten by the eagle, and all of the nutrients, the nitrogen, for example, is going to pass through all their bodies into the next ones. Okay, obviously there's going to be some waste, especially urea. Those things are also going to die. So the decomposers are going to break down all those things, and they're going to get nutrients from them, but they are going to release those nutrients back into the soil, where they're going to be taken up by the grass again. And nutrients is a cycle. Okay, nutrients are going to be cycled through an ecosystem. All right. That is where the first and second laws of thermodynamics come into play. Okay. Basically, energy is going to be lost as heat as we go down, as we go through the trophic levels. Okay, so we're going to lose a little bit of energy each time we go through here. Loss of energy, mostly as heat. And we're also not going to recycle our energy. Okay, even though it's neither created nor destroyed, it's going to enter the earth via the sunlight, but then it's going to stop with the bacteria. Whereas nutrients are going to be indefinitely recycled through the biosphere, unless humans mess it up in any way, of course. Such as maybe sequestering nutrients in a landfill, for example. Okay, so continuing on with the second law of thermodynamics, one of the implications for that is the 10% rule. The 10% rule basically states that 90% of the energy is going to be lost as you move up every trophic level. Okay, so I know that producers are not on this chart, but producers should be down here in this food pyramid or this trophic pyramid. But say that there is 1,000 kilocalories of energy in these primary consumers. Say that those are mice. Those mice are eating grain like seeds all day, every day, and they're getting their energy from those seeds. Okay, there's 1,000 kilocalories in those mice. Most of the energy in those mice is going to be lost. It's going to be lost as heat, which is what is on the slide, but it's also going to be lost in the energy used for movement, and the energy for reproduction, the energy used for homeostasis and for driving its own metabolism. It's going to be lost through growth. Okay, it's going to be lost via waste, like the solid waste that this mice and the liquid waste that this mouse produces. It's going to be lost in a variety of ways, but if you just think about heat, you'll be all right. Okay, 90% is going to be lost as heat, meaning that only 10% remains. So 10% of this original 100%. And again, I know this is a bad example because we really should be starting with the producers, but that's okay. Okay. Say that, what was the example on the other slide? A snake is eating the mouse. That snake only has 10% of the energy available in that mouse. Snake, again, losing energy via heat, losing energy via metabolism and homeostasis, yada, yada, yada. And it's eaten by the eagle. And there is only 1% of the original energy in that system in that eagle. Okay. For this reason, or this is one of the reasons that you'll always see many, many, many more plants in an ecosystem that you'll see herbivores, while you'll see many more herbivores in an ecosystem than you'll see carnivores. Okay, if we look at the African Serengeti, you'll see lots and lots of grass and trees. You'll see fewer antelope and gazelles and water buffalo and hippopotamus, etc. And you'll see even fewer lions. Okay, for every 100 individuals of grass, you might have 10 antelope, and for every 10 antelope, you might have 1 lion. Okay, just rough numbers, and every ecosystem is going to be slightly different. This is a rule, not a law, meaning that it's not, a firm, hard calculation of 10% in every case, but it all averages out to be about 10%. Okay, when you do math for this, super easy. Just move the decimal to the left, 1 digit every time that you move up a trophic level, or just divide by 10 every time that you move up a trophic level. Okay, I've been using these terms trophic levels, but I haven't defined them. So every trophic level is one step in a food chain, one step in a food pyramid, which are showing the same thing. So each one of these arrows that I have is pointing at a trophic level, okay? Each one of these is a trophic level, okay? The grass is a trophic level, the water buffalo is a trophic level, etc. All right. Food chains are a little bit simple, so a little bit more complex is a food web. A food web is all the food chains in a particular ecosystem. All right, and you guys, again, probably know this from middle school, if not elementary school. Some of them can get awfully complex. You will not see one this complex in this class, okay? But they do get more complex. The ones that we use in class are just simplified versions of food webs. But even that previous one is way simpler than a real food web can be. This is an example of a really complex one. But let's get back to those simple food webs. We're actually going to do this example in class, so I'm going to basically skip this. But what I do want to point out right now, in case you aren't here in class, is that you will have to make predictions about what's going to happen in other populations if you mess with a food web. Okay, so if we get rid of these harvest mouse, think about what could happen. Think about what could happen immediately. Think about what could happen 2, 3, 4 trophic levels away. Okay, but again, we'll do this in class. All right, so that's all of the feeding relationship stuff. The last thing that we're going to talk about is one more point having to do with how organisms can interact. But before we get there, we have to talk about tolerances and limiting factors. Okay, again, this should be review from biology class. So in ecological tolerance, this is a range of abiotic variables that an individual or a species can thrive in. I say individual because some individuals may be more tolerant than others of different conditions. Temperature is a really easy one. Let's think about a coconut. A coconut can survive in a certain temperature range, okay? But it cannot survive freezing temperatures. Sorry, almost spelled that wrong. That one would have been embarrassing. It can't survive freezing temperatures. It also can't survive temperatures that would get, just way too hot. Let's say like 110 degrees Fahrenheit plus. Okay, it would die in that range. Say that the coconut's range, I'm going to use Fahrenheit. I know I shouldn't. You know what? I'm not going to. Let's say it can't survive, who knows, 70 degrees Celsius. That's just a made up number. I don't know. But over 70 degrees Celsius, the coconut's not going to survive. So from 0 to 70 degrees Celsius, is the coconut's ecological tolerances. Now, I don't really know if those are the real numbers. This is just made up. It could be, 5 degrees Celsius to, 40, who knows? But the point is that you won't see a coconut growing outside in Colorado because it's outside of its range of tolerances. Our tolerance range could be temperature, could be precipitation, it could be pH of the soil, pH of the water, could be salinity of the water, could be the nutrients that are available. Whatever it is, every species and every individual within a species has a range that it can tolerate. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on, where I'll show you some graphs in a different PowerPoint. A limiting factor is similar, but this is any biotic or abiotic factor that limits the growth, distribution, or abundance of an organism or a population in a specific environment. Okay, temperature again could be a limiting factor. Okay, so one of the limiting factors of a coconut surviving in Colorado is the freezing temperatures that we have during the winter. Okay, the limiting factors for these these wildebeest and zebra in Africa could be water availability. If this pool dries up during the dry season, they will have to move. That changes their distribution, at least for a small little while. Okay, so there are many different limiting factors. Because all natural resources are finite, that means that we have limiting resources. Okay, food, water, space, soil, all of that are limiting resources, and they're all finite. They can all be limiting factors in one way or another. Okay, so when these resources are limited, say, food or space or the soil nutrients or water, we have competition that can ensue. Okay, so when we're talking about competition, competition can be either interspecific, in which case it means among different species. So inter meaning among different, and then intraspecific, which is among the same species, among members of the same species. So intra is basically within. One of the interesting things about this is that the more similar the needs of a species, the more the intense the competition. So in this diagram, both hyenas and lions, not diagram, but picture, both hyenas and lions are carnivores on the African savanna, and they both rely on meat. So their competition is going to be pretty high. They have similar body size, they both hunt in packs, so they're going to compete a lot. But one of the interesting things is that competition is strongest within members of the same species because they require the exact same things, the exact same resources, whether that's soil nutrients or in this case, the different lions in this pride competing with each other for right to the kill. Okay, so we'll talk about this question down here in class, but based on your knowledge of evolution, think about what some of the consequences of interspecific competition might be. Again, we'll talk about it in class, but two of the consequences of interspecific competition is that if you have two species, so I'll say species A and species B, and they both compete for the same resources, species B might outcompete species A and lead to the extinction of species A. But what's maybe more interesting is when species A and species B compete with one another, but they do something called resource partitioning, also called niche partitioning, and I'll typically say niche partitioning in this class, but they will move into slightly different ecological niches. Okay, so they'll start to get different resources from one another. Okay, so let's look at a few examples of those. So some examples of niche partitioning. I have 3 classes of examples and 1 example for each class, but the first one that we'll talk about is diet. The example that I have is Darwin's finches. All of these different finches are specialized for a specific diet based on their beak size and their body shape, and they have partitioned these resources. There's only so much food on these islands, and none of these finches are adept at eating absolutely everything, but some of them are specialized to eating small insects on the wing, some of them are specialized to eating cactus fruits, some of them are specialized to eat large seeds. All right. Thyme. Day and night pollinators are a great example of thyme. These thistles are pollinated by bumblebees and night flying moths. They're both taking advantage of this food source. but they're not competing directly with one another because the bumblebees are pollinating during the day and the moths are pollinating at night. And then spatial. In several islands of the Caribbean, you have these anole lizards, and these lizards, several species can live literally on the same tree, where you will have, one tree with, that's a tree, don't laugh at my drawings. You'll have one species that lives basically on the ground, so that's species 1. Species 2 might just live on the trunk of this tree, eating insects, and species 3 might be living in the canopy. All right, so they're partitioning the insects that are living based off of space. So thank you for sticking with me through this rather long review lecture on ecology. I'm just going to run through the essential knowledge real quick. So this first one on ecosystems, we talked about predator-prey relationships, we talked about symbiotic relationships, and we talked about competition and how competition can result in niche partitioning or resource partitioning. Okay, it can also lead to out-competition, extirpation, and in extreme cases, extinction, but the learning objective, they focus on resource partitioning. We talked quite a bit about primary productivity, and we talked about how primary productivity is typically performed via photosynthesis. We talked about gross versus net primary productivity and how to calculate that. We talked about the units for it. And we talked about how primary productivity occurs in the ocean, all right? Especially via photosynthesis. Again, chemosynthesis really isn't in these learning objectives. You may, I doubt it, but may see a question about chemosynthesis, but I highly doubt it. But it is there, so you should be aware of it. I mean, it's in nature, so you should be aware of it. It's not on the learning objectives, okay? We talked about trophic levels. So all ecosystems depend on that continuous inflow of energy via sunlight. So that high quality energy that they like is the sun in order to maintain structure and function of that ecosystem. And then you have those biogeochemical cycles, which will cycle matter through the ecosystem. So we didn't talk a lot about the biogeochemical cycles here, but we talked about nutrient cycling. Okay, and that's what they mean here. Okay, and then we have terrestrial and near surface marine ecosystems. The energy flows from the sun, okay, to the producers. We talked about energy flow and the 10% rule. You should be able to calculate the 10% rule, and you should be able to talk about how the 10% rule is due to the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, and then food chains and food webs, how they are a model of interlocking food, how a food web is a model of interlocking food chains, and how positive and negative feedback loops can happen in a food web. Basically, when you remove one species from a food web, how it can impact the rest of that food web. Again, we didn't really talk about that a lot here, but we will practice this in class.